The Henderson Legacy. Alexander Henderson, George Washington, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Joseph Tomlinson, Alexander and John Henderson, Margaret and Harmon Blennerhassett, Aaron Burr, Colonel Hugh Phelps, Commandant Archibald Henderson, Isaac and Rebecca Williams, G.W. Henderson, David Putman, A.I. Borman, P.G. Van Winkle. These are but a few of the personalities that make up the Henderson legacy. Voices and images of the past. Men and women whose lives and spirit are intertwined and whose courage and determination created a nation and tamed a wilderness. And in this case, tamed the wilderness that is the Ohio Valley. Their legacy is preserved at Henderson Hall. They were the beginning. In their own time, their accomplishments may have seemed ordinary, but they were by no means ordinary people, and they shaped the future for their descendants and the future of our nation. They were pioneers and adventurers, but they were also educated in the classics, in law and government, schooled in music and art. They brought with them more than just an indomitable pioneer spirit. They brought civilization from the universities of the East, from the drawing rooms of Alexandria, Baltimore, Richmond, and the plantations of the South, Mount Vernon. Yes, they were family friends of George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. Three brothers came, Alexander, John Glassford, and James. Much of what they brought survives today in an unbroken chain of inheritance from the 1750s to the present, a span including 5 centuries or more than 250 years. From a beautiful home in Dumfries, Virginia, 3 Henderson brothers worked their way across the mountains and down the river, cleared the land, and prospered in a new life of hardship and travail. Their first home was a simple log home up the Little Kanawha River called Beach Park. The second, a modest home on the Ohio above Williamstown, and the third, this mansion. First built in 1836 to replace an earlier log dwelling on the river called the Briars, Henderson Hall, finished in 1859, was the home of Alexander's son George Washington Henderson and his wife Elizabeth Ann Tomlinson Henderson. It stands today as one of the most remarkable examples of architecture and original collections of furnishings, artifacts, and a chain of documents left by any American family. Fittingly, the mansion is nestled between 3 historic Adena Indian mounds, 8,000 years old, continuously occupied by the descendants of its builder. The mansion is a living legacy through almost 200 years of the triumphs and tragedies of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, 2 World Wars, and survival through the Cold War. The legacy reflects America, the simple and industrious life of the early settlers, the antebellum years preceding the Civil War, the opulent style of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, and the reserved elegance of the turn of the century. World War I, the Roaring Twenties, the crash, and the Great Depression, World War II, and into the 21st century, all the time inhabited by a Henderson. While a fine example of architecture and furnished for gracious living, it was never, however, an ostentatious show, and survives because of the loving care of one generation to the next. While the original Henderson brothers were struggling in the New West, Brother Archibald joined the Navy, became a Marine, served on the USS Constitution in the War of 1812, distinguished himself, and eventually became the Marine Corps Commandant. He served under 11 presidents, in the process defining to this day what it means to be a Marine. His letters to his family are carefully preserved in the Henderson archives and are today used by the Marines to tell his life story. Such was the Henderson tradition, and still celebrated by the Marines to this day. Brother Archibald visited here in his youthful years, meeting the Blennerhassetts, and then later in the 1840s while escorting William Henry Harrison's body to Cincinnati for burial. Henderson Hall's 21 rooms contain a remarkable collection. The letters and papers record not only the social history of the valley, but its political, business, and industrial development as well. One of the earliest documents is the 1798 journal of John Glassford Henderson, which chronicles the arduous journey from Virginia to the Ohio Valley and then to Burning Springs on the Little Kanawha River. 8 years later, his brother, Alexander Henderson II, recorded in his own hand his deposition of the traitorous Burr-Blennerhassett conspiracy against the Union. Concerning the conspiracy, he wrote in part, "About the 1st of September, 1806, I received a letter from Mr. Blennerhassett that he meant to visit my family in the course of a few days. He came on the day appointed, accompanied by my brother John, and after taking some refreshments, Mr. Blennerhassett began a conversation about the severance of the Union, talked of the advantage it would be to the Western people to have a government of their own, saying that instead of $3 millions which we paid toward the support of the present government at this time, with 100,000 we might support a government of our own." He then mentioned Colonel Burr as a man of brilliant talents as well as great goodness of heart, or words to that effect. Does that sound like a plan for lands west of the Mississippi, as the current interpretation postulates? Henderson turned down Blennerhassett and followed up by alerting Colonel Phelps of the Wood County Militia. He then dispatched an emissary to family friends President Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of State James Madison, alerting them to the conspiracy. What followed was the arrest and then the trial of Burr and an end to their conspiracy. Did the Henderson brothers save the country from an early war? In the same year, the original letter to Brother Richard was neatly filed away, telling of the risky duel over Alexander's honor between himself and another local pioneer, fought just south of Belpre, the only duel ever recorded north of the Ohio River. They shot each other in the leg, both being wounded and crippled for life. Plantation's legacy is a miniature timeline of American history, both triumph and tragedy. Through the years, the plantation and farm ledgers and records documented the buying and selling of local goods and services. The many entries in these accounts and on bills of sale and deeds bear the names of families still prominent in the valley today: James Wood, John Stout, Cooper, Chancellor, Granville, Ogden, Pugh, Reed, Ull, McTaggart, Jackson, Borman, and more. Important and unimportant events were recorded and saved, as from a farm record dated May 20th, 1825. Our friend and benefactor, General Lafayette, passed up the river on the steamer Mechanic, amazed by the large crowds who came to view him. His steamboat hit a snag at Shawnee, Tennessee, and sunk. Lost his carriage and bags, but heaven saved his life. The next line routinely reads, May 22nd, planted my corn today. Diaries exist almost continuously from the 1850s to 1966. The women of the family, often burdened with the care of children, still had the burden of plantation and farm duties, but in their own right, the women were far ahead of their times. Tough, educated survivors. Jane Lithgow, Alexander's wife, Anna Rosalie, G.W.'s wife, Elizabeth Ann, Jock's wife, and Rosalie, unmarried but wed to the Hall. Each made their own mark. Jane had 3 children in this early wilderness, with only one surviving to maturity. Elizabeth Ann had and lost her first 5, dying of scarlet fever in 1836, but then had 6 more, with all but one surviving to continue the legacy. When husband George died in 1866, she ran the plantation with her 3 surviving sons for another 20 years. Anna Rosalie had 5 children, and her daughter, Rosalie, stayed in the mansion to take care of the family and the legacy until 1966. Lastly, younger sister Lorna, the last of that generation to inhabit the hall, created her own life in California after an unsuccessful pursuit of fame in Hollywood. Sadly returned to the mansion, but to let it deteriorate to a dismal state. In the 1960s and 70s, though, she played her small part in keeping alive the legacy. The letters and diaries of more than 5 generations of the Henderson family offer a rare and intimate look into the lives and changing times of both family and friends as they passed from youth to old age. 200 years of documents in an unbroken flow, school books, classics, poetry, practical guides, correspondence, diaries, records, and music are found throughout the home, dating from the late 1700s. The original land grants are there, including the one signed by Patrick Henry, then governor of Virginia, from 1785. To illustrate their priority for education, the original schoolroom at the plantation, built in the 1830s, remains as it was, as do the school books and papers used there. There are also classic textbooks for the early studies in the classics, languages, mathematics, grammar, and writing, from the early 1800s. From the beginning, they were involved as political leaders. The Virginia House of Burgesses, the Wood County Sheriff, Justice of Peace, election officials, the creation of West Virginia, and West Virginia Senate. George Washington Henderson, who built the mansion, was educated at Ohio University. He studied law in Virginia and Marietta. He was a delegate to the critical First Wheeling Convention of May 1861 when Virginia seceded. He stayed loyal to the Union even though he still had slaves, and his family in Virginia elected to join the Confederacy. He was then elected and served in the reformed Virginia legislature, assisting with the birth of West Virginia in 1863. In examining the family documents and memorabilia, the same question repeats itself. Why did they save all these things, and so much of it, taken item by item, of such seeming unimportance? A cracked piece of china or glass, a worn pewter plate or teapot, an IOU from a farmhand, or a letter from a cousin about a new dress, notes of condolence and friendship, photographs given as gifts, invitations, cards, mementos, newspapers, and other artifacts, none of great importance or value, but each a thread woven into a vast tapestry of life. The answer is twofold, and perhaps not so complicated as it might seem. First, they had an innate sense of history and continuity, being raised with such persons as George Washington and other founding fathers as personal and business friends. Having a brother and an uncle who was a celebrated Marine Corps commandant, they knew of greatness and must have felt a sense of destiny. Hence this vast collection of historic documentation, from an original newspaper announcing George Washington's funeral to a mundane letter from a sister seeking fame in Hollywood, and all written by clear hand, developed through years of hard discipline. The second reason, and perhaps the simpler and more obvious one, is they had the space in which to do it. Trunk rooms, attics, basements, storage areas which were needed for no other purpose. The toys and games, dresses, mama's wedding gown, grandfather's chest, great-grandmother's spinning wheel, the ice skates and parasols, a worn but treasured doll, all were carried in loving hands finally to the 3rd floor, there to wait in quiet solitude for 100 years until their time would come. And it has. From a plantation with over 100 slaves, raising corn, wheat, vegetables, cattle, and all manner of domestic animals, to a nationally known and sophisticated horse breeding stable, to the development of a great oil field. That is part of the Henderson legacy. The Henderson oil fields, which prospered before the turn of the century, were perhaps the largest and most productive in the area. Early maps and photographs suggest operations equivalent to the boom days of Texas and Oklahoma, and they had participated in one of the earliest booms in 1861 at their original plantation property across the Little Kanawha from the famous Burning Springs oil field and boomtown. The substantial income these oil fields produced enabled the Henderson brothers to become nationally known as breeders of fine horses, principally standard-bred trotters, which were sold throughout the country for racing and for the carriage trade. The extent and success of their efforts can be seen in an early photograph taken in the late spring of 1891 by a traveling photographer from Zanesville named Thoreau. It shows the front meadow with more than 35 horses, 26 of them mares, and their foals. Horses from as far away as New York and Georgia were sent to the Henderson farm to be boarded and bred. The bloodlines of many of the present-day trotters may still be traced to the Henderson farm sires Sacramento and Nutgard. Unhappily, their success came to an abrupt and tragic end with the burning of the great horse barn at the turn of the century. All that remains today of this period are the giant foundation stones, carefully saved from the original horse barn, the largest in the country, and the pictures, harness, and blanket from the most famous stud, Sacramento, which were again carefully stored on the third floor. Many of the horses were lost in the fire, and much of the equipment destroyed. The enormous cost in both time and money needed to rebuild a business, begun in their youth, now in their middle years, coupled with the advent of the new horseless carriage, made rebuilding too great a task. Now the Henderson brothers could turn their interest to the less demanding task of managing the farm and the profitable oil fields. Brother Henry Clay Henderson entered politics and banking, became president of the Parkersburg National Bank, now United Bank, the West Virginia Western Telephone Company, and later the Williamstown National Bank. Brother Arthur Taylor's daughter married a nationally known baseball star, Richard Harbottle, a teammate of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. Jock and Arthur saw to the management of the family estate, which they and Henry Clay had inherited from their mother Elizabeth Ann in 1888. More than 2,600 acres, including Henderson Hall and the Tomlinson Mansion in Williamstown. These lands extended from what is now the intersection of Interstate 77 and Route 31 to Boaz, encompassed a large portion of Williamstown itself, including Tomlinson Park and the area now occupied by the Fenton Art Glass Company and more recently the Hino Truck Plant. Music and art had always been an important part of life at Henderson Hall. Stephen Foster, a relative, once visited on one of his trips down the Ohio, as did Johnny Appleseed and many others. Jock's wife, Anna Rosalie McIntosh Henderson, was a poet of considerable talent whose work was published not only locally but in a number of national publications as well. She was an active member of many community organizations of her time and did much to make Henderson Hall a center of cultural refinement. While shouldering the burden of raising 5 children and helping husband Jock with a vast farm, she early on spoke and wrote about women's rights. In 1900, her book of verse, Life and Song, was published. Her poems reflect the traditional aspects of life Americans have always cherished. Freedom. Hark, mid the clamor of war's alarms, a nation is calling her sons to arms. A mighty nation whose boundary stands are Atlantic shores and Pacific sands. In the sunny south, in the frozen north, they are hearing her call, my sons, come forth. She wrote of other things, and she often wrote of her own children. Just 2 years have rolled above us since, To be beloved and love us came she, sweet as sweet could be, baby Rosalie. It would be daughter Rosalie Henderson, the baby Rosalie of the 1885 poem, who would, in her own time, contribute immeasurably toward the enrichment and preservation of Henderson Hall. Her artistic talent and influence are evident throughout the house, and most of it the work of her own hands. Embroidery and paintings, jewelry and hand-painted china, Henderson Hall became her life's work, and although she died in 1966, she will be remembered as a gracious hostess who upheld a tradition passed to her by her mother and grandmother. Rosalie's brother, Jock Lee, also remained in the hall during his lifetime. With his death in 1970 and brother Don's in 1968, the farm entered a period of decline, which was to last 14 years, under the operation, or lack thereof, of Sister Lorna. In 1984, the estate and Henderson Hall passed by inheritance to the 4 children of George Travis Henderson, Rosalie's older brother, who had died in a tragic railroad accident in 1928. The last resident of Henderson Hall was one of their descendants, and the great-great-grandchild of the builder, Michael Byer Ralston. He was a successful graphic designer in New York, but came home to spend the last 20 years of his life and all of his resources in its restoration and preservation. He did much to return the estate to its original condition. In 1986, Henderson Hall and 65 acres of land surrounding it between the Ohio River and Route 14, including the family cemetery, was designated as Henderson Hall Historic District and entered on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1985, Henderson Hall was opened to the public by Michael for the first time. This event marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the 18th, 19th, 20th, and now the 21st centuries have been joined in a continuing tradition. Michael Ralston, who died in 2007, willed Henderson Hall to the board of the Oil and Gas Museum and has entrusted it to preserve the long tradition and give Henderson Hall a place in West Virginia and the nation's history worthy of its true value as a unique American legacy, truly unequaled.